For the better part of a decade now, political discourse in the United States has been gripped by the idea of a deep state.
The whole thing has the hallmarks of being scripted by deep state Democrats. I'm Alex Jones.
Unelected deep state operatives who defy the voters to push their own secret agendas.
That somewhere behind the elected government, there is a permanent, unaccountable power structure that actually makes the decisions, that operates in the shadows, and that persists regardless of who wins elections. Trump campaigned on it. Kash Patel wrote a whole book about it. The entire MAGA movement was organized, at least in part, around the promise to dismantle this hidden network of power. And the liberal response was mostly to dismiss this whole thing as a conspiracy theory, to say there is no deep state, the government is just a bureaucracy doing its job. But here's the thing. They're both wrong, and the truth is much more important than either version. There is a permanent, unaccountable power structure embedded in the American state that operates beyond the reach of electoral politics. It is real, and it is documented.
It's the military-industrial complex. It's the trillion-dollar permanent warfare state. The defense contractors, the intelligence agencies, the CIA, FBI, NSA. It's the weapons programs, the 750 military bases in 80 countries that no president of either party has seriously challenged since 1950. It is the most powerful institutional force in American society. It operates beyond democratic accountability, and that's by design. And we can tell you exactly when it was created, who created it, and what document authorized it.
Crisp, sunshiny weather heralds the inauguration of the President of the United States. As the world pauses to await the attitude toward international policy as pronounced by the chief spokesman for the United States,
I, Harry S. Truman, do solemnly swear that I will faithfully execute the office of President of the United States.
On April 7, 1950, a 66-page document landed on President Harry Truman's desk, classified top secret. Its filing number was NSC-68. It called for a permanent military buildup so massive that it would transform the United States from a country that had always demobilized after wars into one that maintained wartime levels of military spending indefinitely in times of peace and in times of war. NSC-68, within a year of the document being signed, increased the defense budget, or the war budget, 5 times over. And the remarkable thing is that it never came back down. The military-industrial complex that Eisenhower would warn about in his 1961 farewell address, well, NSC-68 is the document that built it.
And the man who wrote it was not a general. He was not an intelligence officer. He was a former Wall Street investment banker named Paul Nitze.
Well, I've served in the government off and on over a course of 50 or 60 years. When the situation gets dangerous, one should try to eliminate all emotion from one's analysis. One should indeed become a very cold-blooded analyst. That, I think, perhaps justifies the epithet of cold warrior. My own view is it was necessary and it was effective. So I stand condemned of what I think was a minor crime.
He married into Standard Oil money, and he was put in charge of the State Department's policy planning staff, specifically because the Secretary of State at that time, Dean Acheson, knew that he would produce exactly this kind of document. One designed, in Acheson's own words, to, quote, bludgeon the mind of the top government into accepting a program of massive and permanent rearmament.
I'm Leanne Sima Fullahan, here with Brian Becker, and this is the Socialist Program. This is another episode in our series on key moments in the history of U.S. imperialist intervention since the end of World War II, where we're taking deep dives into the Pentagon and CIA operations that shaped American foreign policy and global strategy. Today, we're covering NSC-68, National Security Council Report 68. This is not a covert operation in the traditional sense. You're not going to find assassination plots here, no sabotage raids. What we're looking at is something arguably more consequential. It's a 66-page policy paper that provided the intellectual and strategic framework for every covert operation, every military intervention, and every regime change operation that followed it.
To understand what NSC-68 was and what it did, it's important to understand that there was a brief window between 1945 and 1950 when the United States was not yet a permanent warfare state.
One day he heard the bells of peace, turned his back on the darkened battlefields, and raised his arms to the bright, new future.
As World War II was coming to an end, the U.S. military numbered about 12 million men and women in uniform. They were stationed all over the world. The U.S. did not have a huge network of permanent foreign military installations all over the world. In August 1945, Japan surrendered to the United States.
The battleship Missouri, 53,000-ton flagship of Admiral Halsey's Third Fleet, becomes the scene of an unforgettable ceremony marking the complete and formal surrender of Japan. General MacArthur speaks.
It is my earnest hope, and indeed the hope of all mankind, that from this solemn occasion a better world shall emerge out of the blood and carnage of the past.
Immediately, U.S. service members in Asia, and in fact throughout the world, assumed, since the war was over, that they would come home to their families, to their jobs, and to their communities. U.S. policymakers were unsure what to do. Should these forces remain overseas, or should they, as they had in the past, be demobilized? A mass movement of U.S. service members spontaneously took shape. Bring the troops home now became a slogan that appeared on the banners of rallies and demonstrations organized by U.S. troops, U.S. service members overseas. And it was under this pressure the demobilization, in fact, began.
The Queen Elizabeth, world's largest ocean liner, pulls into New York Harbor. Aboard are almost 15,000 happy GIs, most of them men of the 8th Air Force, jamming every square inch of deck space for a look at the USA. These are the guys who helped win it for us against the Nazis, and the entire nation welcomes them home.
Within 2 years, the 12 million person military was down to about 1.5 million people. The U.S. Army went from 89 divisions to just 12. And sectors of the U.S. military brass, the top officials in the Pentagon, were unhappy about the demobilization. General George Marshall called the process not a demobilization, but a rout.
I want to say a little bit more about this movement of soldiers, sailors, and Marines. In January 1946, tens of thousands of GIs staged mass demonstrations across the Pacific and across Europe, demanding to go home. In Manila, 20,000 soldiers marched on the headquarters of the Western Pacific Command. In Paris, soldiers marched down the Champs-Élysées carrying signs reading, "We want to go home." Back in the US, the wives and mothers of soldiers formed bring back daddy clubs, and mailed baby shoes to congressmen. Senators' offices were flooded with letters, 200 to 1 against maintaining troops overseas. Soldiers who had won the war were refusing to serve as an occupation army for an empire that they hadn't signed up for, and Congress panicked.
U.S. policymakers had been anticipating what the post-World War II world order would look like. There was an active political debate within the Roosevelt administration starting around 1943, when it was clear that the United States was going to win the war.
Optimism from across the Atlantic. President Roosevelt addresses Congress.
Hitler and Mussolini, they will understand now the enormity of their miscalculation.
Germany and Japan were going to be defeated, and the British Empire would be severely weakened. What the policymakers did not fully anticipate was that the Soviet Union and the Soviet Red Army would become so dominant because of their crushing counteroffensive that defeated Nazism and German fascism and liberated big parts of Eastern and Central Europe.
In spite of enormous losses in men and material, our Russian ally fought back fiercely. We know about the heroism of the Soviets throughout this agonizing summer and autumn when the whole weight of the German army has fallen upon them.
It was during this time that U.S. policymakers had decided on the creation of the United Nations.
The signing is done. The Great Charter is completed. This draft of mankind's deepest hopes already a historic document. Perhaps the Magna Carta of peace-loving humanity itself.
They also decided to create the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund as economic instruments for the post-World War II world order.
At Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, delegates from 44 allied and associate countries arrived for the opening of the United Nations Monetary and Financial Conference. Invited by President Roosevelt, these meetings are designed to promote trade in the post-war world and to create a foundation for lasting peace.
These policymakers knew full well that the United States was emerging as the dominant world power as a consequence of the war and the weakening of the other major capitalist powers as a consequence of the magnitude of the violence during the war.
This city, hitherto almost untouched, has been carpeted by heavy and super heavy high explosives and incendiaries. Dresden is a heap of ruins. It has been smashed to atoms.
Although there was a great deal of thought put into the creation of a new world order, including, as you mentioned, the United Nations, there was not yet a decision about whether U.S. military personnel would be stationed permanently all over the world. Nor was there a decision to maintain a permanent, in-place, fully mobilized military machine even during peacetime. In short, the notion of a permanent military-industrial complex was not yet part of U.S. strategic thinking.
So between 1943 and 45, U.S. policymakers are aware that there's going to be a new world order. They've just experienced two world wars, World War I and World War II. The world was being swept by anti-colonial revolutions, many of which were led by socialists and communists. So they knew that there needed to be a new world order. So the World Bank, the IMF, and of course the United Nations are pillars there, but they are not yet thinking about a global military machine where U.S. troops, equipment, supplies, and weapons are stationed everywhere.
There was also a keen sense within the Democratic Party leadership and in sections of the ruling class that society would need a continuation and perhaps an expansion of FDR's New Deal programs that helped mitigate the impact of the Great Depression.
So that was Social Security, unemployment insurance, work relief programs, in other words, job creation.
And then it was really military spending and then the full mobilization of the country for war production and the deployment of millions of people into the armed forces at the start of World War II that really brought the economic depression of the 1930s to an end. The United States in 1945 had the largest, most productive industrial economy in human history. It had factories that had been making tanks and planes and ships at an astonishing scale.
The skill and strength of more than 60 million men and women is now devoted to the production of the materials of war. Small arms pour from 1,000 factories converted from peacetime production. In 1 year alone, they will turn out 670,000 machine guns, over 10 billion rounds of small arms ammunition.
And the question was, what happens to all of that capacity now that the war was ending? Truman assumed that government spending in other areas might help avoid a return to economic depression. So Truman proposed something called the Fair Deal, which included a national health insurance program, federal aid for education, expanded Social Security, and called for 1 million units of public housing.
Ladies and gentlemen, the President of the United States.
Fellow citizens, on August the 18th, 1945, 4 days after the surrender of Japan, I issued Executive Order 9599, which laid down the guiding policies of your government during the transition from war to peace. Management sometimes forgets that business cannot prosper without customers who make good wages and have money in their pockets.
But just as the New Deal programs of FDR only temporarily mitigated but did not end the capitalist economic depression, the Great Depression of the 1930s, the U.S. economy under Truman began to slide down once again, even by the end of 1947. In other words, just 2 years after the end of World War II, and the U.S. economy entered another recession by 1948.
While the nation groans under a mountain of commodities designed for war and only partially adaptable to peace, and factory space is jammed with surplus goods, returning veterans and war workers will stand idle. Stagnation will interfere with the right to work and earn a living. Such is the threat to post-war industrial America.
Without war production as a stimulant to the capitalist economy, it was clear that economic recessions or depressions might be the norm rather than anomalies.
Owning a share in American industry is like owning a share in the future of our nation. But remember, John Q., there is a risk.
Powerful forces within the political establishment were making the argument that military spending, and it alone, especially if the military spending was big enough, would be an economic stimulant to counteract the tendency towards economic depression.
At first, Truman resisted the demand to switch government spending.
But there were powerful forces pushing in the other direction. The military establishment, the defense contractors who had operated on guaranteed profit, cost-plus contracts during the war, they had no interest in returning to the competitive pressures of a civilian market. And also there was the intelligence apparatus that had been built during the war, the OSS, which became the CIA in 1947.
And then the geostrategic international situation shifted dramatically as a consequence of the decision by the United States, by some of these same politicians and policymakers, to establish NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, which they did in April 1949.
On April 4th, 1949, the North Atlantic Treaty was signed by Norway, Denmark, the Netherlands, Belgium, Luxembourg, France, Italy, Portugal, the United Kingdom, Iceland, Canada, and the United States. This union of 12 nations became known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or more simply, NATO. They were sworn to stand together against aggression. An attack against one would be an attack against all.
NATO bound West European countries to the United States in the form of a military alliance against the Soviet Union and against left-wing forces in Western Europe. It was all done in the name of protecting Europe from a potential Soviet threat, and this gave the hawks within the Truman administration exactly what they needed.
And 5 months later, in September 1949, the Soviet Union tested its first atomic weapon, ending the American nuclear monopoly years earlier than most U.S. policymakers and analysts had predicted.
President Truman's dramatic announcement that Russia has created an atomic explosion sends reporters racing for Flushing Meadow, where Russia's Vyshinsky arrives to address the United Nations.
Mr. Vyshinsky, have you got any statement about President Truman's statement on the atomic bomb? Please, excuse me. Does Russia have the atomic bomb? No, sir.
This was an astonishing accomplishment for the Soviet Union to have gained not nuclear parity, but a nuclear weapon within a few years.
Then just 1 month later, in October 1949, Chairman Mao proclaimed the People's Republic of China. That meant a quarter of the world's population was leaving the orbit of Western capital. In Washington, the right wing was screaming about who lost China, as if China had been the U.S.'s to lose.
The fall of China to the communists remains a subject for intense debate. How did this happen? How could it have been avoided?
And the political pressure on Truman to do something, to spend more, to arm more, to commit more was becoming quite overwhelming.
What the hawks in Washington needed was a document, a strategic framework that would settle this argument, end this debate, that would override Truman's initial fiscal caution and lock in permanent military mobilization as the new normal. That's what NSC-68 was designed to do.
Paul Nitze is one of those figures who shaped the 20th century from behind closed doors, and most people have never heard of him. He grew up wealthy. He went to Harvard. He went straight to Wall Street after graduating and joined Dillon, Read & Company in 1929, which is the same investment bank that produced James Forrestal, who became the first Secretary of Defense.
Yeah, and Dillon Read had deep ties to German industry, including before World War II during the rise of Nazism. Dillon Read had underwritten German bonds in the 1920s, and its people moved between finance and government, the revolving door, as if there were no boundary between the two, because for them, there was no boundary.
By his early 30s, Nitze was a vice president at the bank. He married Phyllis Pratt, whose father was a major Standard Oil shareholder and whose mother had been a Republican congresswoman from New York. So finance capital married oil capital. And Nitze carried that class position into government like a credential because in Washington it was one.
And I decided the first thing that had to be done for me was to make some money, and having made some money, then to use that to achieve some position in the government where I could have an impact upon international affairs.
But the experience that really defined his career came in the fall of 1945, when he was assigned to the United States Strategic Bombing Survey. Remember that organization, United States Strategic Bombing Survey. He was sent to Japan to assess what the Allied bombing campaign had accomplished. And, of course, he went to Hiroshima. He went to Nagasaki. He walked through the ruins. He studied the blast radii, the casualty estimates. He studied the structural damage patterns. And what's revealing is that he came away not horrified by the impact of dropping nuclear weapons on a civilian population center. Not moved towards restraint, but a new calculation.
Nitze's primary conclusion was that strategic bombing, including nuclear weapons, could be a rational instrument of policy if properly calibrated. For the physicists who built the atomic bomb, like Oppenheimer, the weapon was apocalyptic. It was something to be controlled, limited, and ultimately abolished. But for Paul Nitze, it was a tool, and it was a very powerful tool that the U.S. needed more of and needed to maintain superiority in. This is the banker's instinct. Don't moralize about the asset, just manage the portfolio.
And that's exactly the person that Dean Acheson, the Secretary of State, wanted to be writing this document. In the early 50s, Acheson fired George Kennan from the State Department's policy planning staff and replaced him with Nitze. And the reason tells you everything about what NSC-68 was designed to be. And just for our audience, this was a huge debate going on inside the U.S. government between anti-communist fanatics and other anti-communist fanatics.
George Kennan was the architect of the concept of containment in its original form. Selective, restrained, focused on a few strategic points, primarily using political and economic measures with military force as a last resort. He believed that Soviet leadership was cautious and opportunistic and primarily concerned with maintaining its own sphere rather than conquering the world. So he thought that patient containment would allow the internal contradictions of the Soviet system to work themselves out over time.
Ambassador George Kennan, pleasure to have you here. You don't think we should be necessarily forcing democracy on nations around the world, that we have to understand the differences?
That is correct. If we go to them and say to them, you ought to be like us, that doesn't have the effect we want to have. If we invite them to come to this country or to look at our media products, read our books, see the evidences of our civilization, and make up their own minds, that is much more effective.
Right. So Kennan was also hoping for the end of socialism and communism. He entertained ideas of counter-revolution. He thought the internal contradictions within the socialist camp could mature over time and lead to capitalist restoration. So George Kennan is not a progressive person, but he had a different approach than Paul Nitze and the architects of NSC-68.
Yeah, exactly. I think this is a very important point because often in the retelling of this history, Kennan kind of gets held up as some sort of reasonable alternative or a peace figure. But Kennan truly was, as you said, an imperialist. He just had a different theory of how to run the empire. Kennan is the man who wrote in a classified State Department memo in 1948, quote, "We have about 50% of the world's wealth, but only 6.3% of its population. In this situation, we cannot fail to be the object of envy and resentment. Our real task in the coming period is to devise a pattern of relationships which will permit us to maintain this position of disparity," end quote.
And there is a reason why the United States and its population of about 6% of the world's people was able to produce and consume about 50% of the world's wealth. Big parts of the world had been colonized. Big parts of the world had been semi-colonies and were consequently underdeveloped. And then the other parts of the world, meaning the imperialist capitalist countries, had been devastated by the war itself.
So Kennan's argument with Nitze wasn't about whether the United States should control the global order. It was just about how. Kennan thought you could do it more cheaply, more quietly, through economic leverage and political manipulation at a few key pressure points. But Nitze and Acheson wanted the full military apparatus to be permanent and to be global.
Which is an important distinction because it tells you something about the range of acceptable debate inside the U.S. national security establishment. The argument was never between empire and no empire. It was between different management strategies for the same empire. And even the more restrained version, Kennan's version, was explicitly about preserving a global wealth disparity that benefited the U.S. ruling class. That was the floor of the conversation, not the ceiling.
So Acheson decided that even Kennan's version wasn't aggressive enough. He wanted a massive, permanent rearmament and a global military posture, and he knew that Kennan would never write that plan out. He would never write that document. So Acheson brought in Nitze, a Wall Street man, a hawk, someone who understood that the purpose of NSC-68 was not to analyze the situation objectively, but rather it was to construct an argument so terrifying that it would overwhelm all opposition.
And Nitze delivered.
We went at the job of a radical, fundamental review of U.S. policy, its basics, bases, and what we ought to do in the future. And that document, having been directed by the National Security Council, was called NSC-68. It set forth ways we could improve the capability of our military forces, why we should do that, and what the significance would be of such a strengthening. The defense budget had been someplace between $12.5 and $13 billion a year. And my estimate as to what this program that we were recommending would cost was $40 billion a year. I told Dean Acheson that that was my estimate, and asked his advice as to whether we should put it in the report. And Acheson said, for goodness sakes, don't. It is important to get the policy agreed first.
NSC-68, his document, presented the Soviet Union as an existential, fanatically, ideologically driven threat bent on world domination, and the language was deliberately apocalyptic. Quote, the issues that face us are momentous, involving the fulfillment or destruction not only of this republic, but of civilization itself. Those are the words of Nitze. This was, as Acheson later admitted, designed to make the case clearer than truth, meaning not true, which is a remarkable thing for a Secretary of State to say about his own government's most important strategic document. It was a sales pitch for the most expensive product in U.S. history.
Clearer than truth. I mean, that's Acheson admitting after the fact that this was propaganda masquerading as analysis.
And what the document prescribed was total.
It prescribed a massive immediate military buildup. It pushed defense spending from around 5% of GDP towards 20%. That means it's full wartime mobilization sustained indefinitely in what was officially peacetime. It called for the development of the hydrogen bomb.
1,000 times more powerful than the now outdated atom bomb.
It called for a dramatic expansion of conventional forces and the capacity to fight wars anywhere on the globe simultaneously. It prescribed the subordination of diplomacy to military imperatives.
And one might really think about diplomacy under these circumstances as simply an adjunct or an auxiliary or as an extension of military strategy, not as something different.
And the critical doctrinal shift in the document was that it outlined that communist advances anywhere on Earth, not just in the strategic centers that Kennan had identified, constituted existential threats to the United States that justified any response.
So a communist insurgency in Vietnam, in Southeast Asia, or a socialist government in Latin America, a national liberation movement in Africa, all, according to NSC-68, were part of a single global design, a monolith, headquartered in Moscow.
This is the intellectual foundation for the war in Vietnam, for the coups waged against the governments of Iran and Guatemala, for the subversion and invasion of Cuba, for every intervention that we're covering in this series.
And undergirding all of it was this additional economic argument that would prove enormously consequential too. The claim that the U.S. economy could absorb this level of military spending. Not only that, but it was actually good for the economy, that military contracts would create jobs and drive growth, not to mention profits. This is the birth of the permanent war economy, the argument that military spending isn't a drain on the economy, but is actually good for the economy. In fact, it is the economy.
So when Harry Truman received NSC-68 in April 1950, he didn't sign it. He was still trying to hold the line on spending. He was still committed to his domestic agenda. So he sent it back for review and he asked for cost estimates, which Nitze had deliberately left out because a price tag would have made it much easier to reject. By June, Nitze had kind of given up on this.
And then on January 25th, 1950, fighting erupted along the 38th parallel in Korea, and what we in the United States know as the Korean War began. By the way, the war is called something different in North Korea. In the Democratic People's Republic of Korea, the war is called the Fatherland Liberation War. Anyway, on June 25th, 1950, the war began and everything changes.
The U.S. narrative of what happened that day, the narrative that was used to sell NSC-68, is that North Korean forces launched an unprovoked invasion of a free and democratic South Korea.
On June 24, 1950, the Republic of Korea enjoyed peace. But across the 38th parallel lay red-dominated North Korea. On June 25, 1950, the communist forces from the north struck without warning.
But the actual history is far more complicated than the official version allows.
It is far more complicated, to put it mildly. Korea had been a Japanese colony for 35 years, officially a colony. It had been under Japanese domination longer than that. Instead of being liberated at the end of World War II in August 1945, the peninsula was divided in half by two junior American military officers, Dean Rusk, who later played a major role in the Kennedy administration, and Charles Bonesteel, who were given 30 minutes, yes, 30 minutes, and a National Geographic map to draw a line that would keep Seoul in the American zone and the northern half of Korea in the Soviet zone of occupation. In this process, no Korean person was consulted. As Bruce Cummins documents in his The Origins of the Korean War, this was a completely arbitrary decision by two men who knew nothing about the country they were cutting in half.
Well, we looked at the map and thought that it would be a good idea if Seoul, the capital of Korea, were in our zone of occupation. But we knew that the Army would not want us to go very far beyond that, and so we looked north of Korea, and there was no clearly distinguishing geographic feature, but there was a 38th parallel. And so we came back and suggested that. What none of us there at that meeting from the State Department or the Army knew was that earlier in the century there had been discussions between the Russians and the Japanese about a division of a sphere of influence in Korea along the 38th parallel. Had we known that, we would have selected any other dividing line.
In the U.S. occupation zone, the U.S. military government dismantled all the grassroots democratic bodies that Koreans had spontaneously organized after liberation.
The People's Committees sent representatives to a national conference in Seoul, which then proclaimed itself as the government of Korea. And some of us thought that they ought to be carried on. Then, as time went on, the Americans, of course, in effect legitimated the Japanese government structure, although they peeled off the Japanese. It was still the same structure. And one by one, the People's Committees were disestablished with varying degrees of force.
Then the U.S. reinstated the Japanese colonial police.
The police were very cruel. It was not very just, and people were tortured to produce statements for the prosecutors.
And they installed Syngman Rhee, who was a right-wing exile with no popular base inside Korea, to be the leader.
Yeah, Syngman Rhee was brought from the United States to Korea to become the head of state. What followed was years of mass political violence. Cummins documents in his book, using declassified U.S. military records, that somewhere between 100,000 and 200,000 people were killed during the political repression in South Korea prior to the war, before June 1950. This included the famous or infamous Jeju Massacre of 1948 and the Bodo League executions.
The massacre happened when I was 9. I'm 83 now. I was hit on the shoulder blade with the club, and I collapsed on the ground. I still can't raise this arm up high. A soldier yelled out something, and suddenly there was gunfire, and men's heads disappeared. As if on signal, machine guns started firing too. Ta-ta-ta-ta-ta-ta.
She estimates that dozens of her extended family members were killed, including her 3-year-old brother, who was clubbed to death.
What Americans were told was a free nation, that would be South Korea, was under attack from a North Korea aggressor. In fact, this state was an authoritarian client state, a military dictatorship engaged in mass violence against the working class and peasantry of its own population.
And the lead up to what happened on June 25 itself was far murkier than the official story. Both sides had been conducting military operations along the 38th parallel for years. South Korean forces had attacked and briefly captured the northern town of Jeju. Ri had spoken publicly and repeatedly about marching north. And the U.S. trained South Korean commandos who infiltrated the north and even attempted to assassinate Kim Il-sung.
And then, of course, there is John Foster Dulles. Under Eisenhower, he becomes Secretary of State. But on June 19, 1950, 6 days before the war broke out, Dulles, who was serving as a special consultant to the State Department, traveled to the 38th parallel with the South Korean defense minister and inspected the line. This is the demilitarized zone. There is a famous photograph of him standing there, staring north. Dulles addressed the South Korean National Assembly and told the assembly that they would, quote, never be alone. On June 22nd, 3 days before the fighting began, Dulles publicly said, the United States will soon take positive action on Korea. That's a quote. He then flew to Tokyo and met with General MacArthur, General Bradley, and Defense Secretary Johnson.
At Haneda Air Base, Dulles warns General MacArthur what to expect. It is their last handclasp before the Cold War gets hot.
None of this, of course, proves that the United States orchestrated the outbreak of the war, but it makes the official narrative that Washington was caught completely off guard difficult, I would say impossible to sustain.
What we can say with certainty is that the U.S. government and media provided a completely false narrative about what caused the 1950 war in Korea. More importantly is how the outbreak of war in Korea provided a necessary pretext for NSC-68 and the creation of the U.S. military-industrial complex. A State Department official captured this dynamic perfectly. This is the quote. He said, "Thank God Korea came along." Not thank God that we can help the Korean people, thank God that we have the event we needed to justify the policy we already wanted.
This was the kind of thing that we had predicted or was consistent with our analysis of the Soviet Union and its possible actions in NSC-68. So NSC-68 became really widely accepted and did form the basis of U.S. security policy.
The Korean War should be recognized as a major historical marker in the Cold War. On the side of South Korea was the United States and 26 other nations organized by the United States under the flag of the United Nations. Supporting North Korea was the Soviet Union, the People's Republic of China, Vietnam, and all of the newly formed socialist governments in Eastern and Central Europe. So you had a war in this tiny peninsula in Korea where all the global forces representing two hostile class camps. One camp represented by the United States, the capitalist camp on one side, and on the other side, the socialist governments led by, at that time, the Soviet Union. So there was, in fact, a global class confrontation taking shape on the Korean Peninsula, all of the socialist governments supporting the North, all the capitalist governments supporting the South. This was a new moment in world politics.
Just to go over this timeline really quickly so we don't lose it, Nitze submits NSC-68 in April 1950. Truman is hesitant. He wants to know the cost. Nitze starts to lose hope by June. And then a few weeks later, June 25, the Korea War breaks out. And then Truman signs NSC-68 in September 1950.
The President of the United States.
The free men of the world have but one choice if they are to remain free. They must oppose strength with strength.
Yes, and that's where defense spending goes up by 5 times in a single year.
The war in Korea itself killed over 4 million people. The vast majority of them were Korean civilians. The U.S. Air Force bombed Korea so extensively that Curtis LeMay estimated that they killed 20% of the population. The main complaint of U.S. pilots was that there was nothing left to bomb when they were sent out on air raid missions.
And when Curtis LeMay made the point that 20%, that was his estimate of the Korean population, had been killed by U.S. bombing, he didn't say that with regret. He thought that was a cause for celebration.
When the pilots ran out of urban targets, they started bombing irrigation dams to flood agricultural areas and destroy the rice crop. So they were deliberately targeting civilian food supplies. And all of this is documented in Air Force records and celebrated in after-action reports.
The bombers came without warning. Too many people died because of the bombing. You found dead people everywhere.
길가에 가면 그 시체가 없는 데가 없었고
There was hardly a single house left standing.
집 하나 온전한 집이 하나 남았.
They bombed the big cities, the villages, and the countryside in the same way.
농촌에 할 거 없이 몽땅 다
I saw it all with my own eyes.
이건 내가 직접 내가 눈으로 봤습니다.
In the first days of the war, the North Korean military swept south. They were welcomed as liberators by villagers, by peasants who had formed people's committees all through the southern part of Korea.
We believed that we had to fight for our motherland, for our people, for our leader, Kim Il-sung. We believed it would be better to liberate the South and to unify Korea. That's what we were fighting for.
But by the end of 1950, as U.S. and Allied forces arrived, they also were able to seize the military initiative, and they were marching north. They were marching all the way to the top of North Korea, towards Mount Baekdu, and possibly into China.
But more than 1 million-strong Chinese military force, working alongside North Korean partisans and guerrilla units, staged a massive counterattack and drove the United States forces back to the 38th parallel.
And that's where the war ends. It takes another 3 years before the signing of the armistice in July 1953. But that's where the war ends, basically where it started, at the 38th parallel. And there was an armistice, meaning the military conflict was coming to an end, but there was no peace treaty. So technically, the two sides remained at war. Well, actually, it was more than two sides, because the United States was also a belligerent.
With fighting ended, a political conference is slated to deal with the touchy problem of unifying Korea and assuring peace.
We have won an armistice on a single battleground, not peace in the world.
And today, the United States still has over 28,000 troops in southern Korea. And the war's primary lasting achievement, from the perspective of Washington, D.C., from the point of view of the policymakers, was it made NSC-68 policy forever.
So that's the story of NSC-68. Now let's talk about what it means. The first thing to understand is who built the system and whose interest it served. Look at the people in the room. Nitze came from Dillon Reed, married into Standard Oil money. Forrestal, the first Secretary of Defense, came from the same bank. Atchison was a corporate lawyer from Covington and Burling. Robert Lovett, who succeeded Marshall as Secretary of Defense, came from Brown Brothers Harriman. John McCloy, the High Commissioner for Germany, was a corporate lawyer so embedded in the power structure that his biographer called him a chairman of the establishment. These people were not career civil servants trying to navigate a complex geopolitical situation. They were representatives of the American financial elite, and they built a system that served the interests of their class for 3/4 of a century.
And the system that these people, that this class built, has no precedent in human history. NSC-68 justified constructing a worldwide network of bases, alliances, and forward deployed forces. Today, that means about 750 U.S. military bases and installations in more than 80 countries.
No empire has ever maintained anything at all comparable. And this provided the blanket justification for covert operations. The movements led by communists and socialists, and those led by anti-imperialist nationalists in the global South countries, were all considered to be existential threats to the United States, and so any and all methods to destroy them were now on the table.
And in many ways, it changed the form of government in the United States. And that's important to think about. Although the U.S. Constitution mandates that U.S. wars must be declared by Congress, NSC-68 provided the framework for the massive consolidation of power in the executive branch, that is, the presidential branch of government. By having a tool for permanent war and a permanent in-place military apparatus, supplemented by a permanent in-place covert intelligence apparatus, and having a permanent in-place enemy, that would be the communists and radicals between 1945 and 1990, the scene had been set for a transformation in the use of political power inside the United States.
Congress was basically reduced to a talk shop, and real power resided in the executive branch. It's noteworthy that the U.S. Congress has not declared war one time since the adoption of NSC-68, even though the United States has been at war almost constantly since then. The system established by NSC-68 meant that you didn't need separate authorization for overthrowing Mossadegh in Iran or Arbenz in Guatemala, or for launching the Bay of Pigs. NSC-68 had already established the framework.
Let's mention NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization.
Yes. So even though NATO was formed shortly before NSC-68 was officially introduced in April 1950, it must be recognized that NATO goes hand in hand with the pillars of NSC-68. Once NSC-68 was signed and the military budget exploded, NATO became the institutional framework for the permanent American military presence in Europe. American bases, American troops, American nuclear weapons were all stationed on European soil indefinitely.
NATO gave the United States the legal architecture to project military power across an entire continent, meaning Europe, under the banner of collective defense. And it locked European countries into a security relationship in which the United States set the term. NATO bases were essentially U.S. bases. U.S. military forces populated those bases all over Europe.
The Europeans got a security guarantee, and what the United States got in exchange was a forward-deployed military infrastructure, political leverage over all allied governments, and a permanent justification for the defense spending that NSC-68 demanded.
So NATO didn't just defend Western Europe from the Soviet Union, and that was the position, that was the public line. It integrated Western Europe into a U.S. military system in a way that persists to this day, even though the Soviet Union collapsed more than 35 years ago.
So NATO was created to ensure U.S. dominance in Western Europe and as a way to militarily encircle the Soviet Union. The argument that it was a defensive alliance to protect Europe from a Soviet attack should be understood for exactly what it is, just propaganda. The fact that NATO was not abolished, but rather expanded after the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, demonstrates so clearly that it was not a defensive reaction to a possible Soviet threat, but rather the idea of a Soviet threat was the pretext for the creation of a US-led military alliance in Europe. Otherwise, NATO clearly would have been abolished when the Soviet Union was abolished, but NATO has expanded since 1991. Why does it still exist? Why has it expanded? Why is it now on Russia's border?
It's on Russia's border because NATO is never about defense, no matter what the propaganda said. It was about maintaining the structure of U.S. dominance in Europe after World War II. And that structure has its own institutional momentum, its own budgets, its own bureaucracies, its own reason for being that has nothing to do with, quote, whatever threat exists. That, in fact, is the NSC-68 logic applied to an alliance. The framework outlasts the justification because too many interests, principally economic interests, depend on it continuing.
NSC-68 didn't just militarize foreign policy, it killed any alternative. It foreclosed the possibility of redirecting wartime productive capacity towards domestic needs.
And the permanent war economy replaced the possibility of a peacetime social investment economy, and that wasn't an accident.
No, that was the point. There's another possibility here. If the argument made by the apologists for a permanent war machine are accurate, meaning that the U.S. economy really does require military spending to maintain stability, or that domestic needs spending is not enough of a stimulant to keep the economy going on an upward path, well, I think that would be a profound indictment of U.S. capitalism, because it would mean that its economic stability is based on being a permanent warfare state, which incentivizes endless war.
In essence, this was always the second argument to sell NSC-68, that military spending stimulates growth. It's a Keynesian-type justification for funneling public money to private capital. The government spends, contractors profit, maybe some of it trickles into wages and local economies, and it's all presented as prosperity. But in reality, the wealth flows upwards. Contracts go to corporations, and so do the profits.
By the mid-1950s, defense spending consumed over half the discretionary federal budget. In the decades that followed, the United States spent more on its military than the next several countries combined. That's a pattern that persists to this day. Meanwhile, the US, the country that won World War II and possessed the industrial capacity to build anything, could not build a national healthcare system, could not build adequate public housing, and could not maintain its own infrastructure.
And of course, it could do all those things. This was a choice. Let's call it the NSC-68 choice.
The richest country in human history, with crumbling schools and crumbling bridges and a military budget approaching $1 trillion a year, that's the legacy of NSC-68.
And it's not like people don't see this. Everyone can feel the contradiction, but maybe they just can't name it, because the framework that created it has been so thoroughly normalized that questioning the military budget is treated as unpatriotic rather than common sense.
And that connects directly to what we said at the top of the episode about this idea of the deep state. We've now walked through the story, the document, the people who wrote it, what it prescribed, the war that made it policy. And what we've just described is the origins of the actual deep state. It's not the version from conspiracy theories. It's not about rogue bureaucrats in a basement. The permanent warfare state built by Wall Street bankers, embedded in the economy by design and operating beyond democratic accountability for 75 years, that's what we're talking about.
And that's what makes the real version of the deep state so much more significant than the conspiracy theory. It's not hidden at all. It's not a secret cabal meeting in a basement or in the boardroom of a Wall Street bank. It is the defense budget. It's the almost $1 trillion, and by next year it will be more than $1 trillion, that flows every year to the Pentagon and to the intelligence agencies and to the private contractors. It's a figure that has never been seriously challenged by any president of either party since 1950. Even the most liberal political candidates, like Bernie Sanders in 2016 and 2020, proposed a 10% decrease in a budget that is almost $1 trillion, or earlier in the hundreds of billions of dollars. That's not a real change in direction.
It's also the revolving door between the Pentagon and the defense industry boardrooms, where the same people cycle back and forth between regulating contracts and profiting from them. It's the intelligence agencies that run covert operations on the authority of secret findings that most members of Congress will never see. None of this is hidden. It's all in the budget. It's all in public record. But it operates with the kind of institutional momentum that is effectively beyond democratic control because it was designed to be.
And there's complicity at all levels. When you think about the mainstream media, I mean, what we're talking about today with NSC-68, not hidden, not a secret conspiracy, not done in the basement. It's open. The public record is clear, especially since the classified records were released 25 years after NSC-68 was initially adopted. But no one in the mainstream media, no reporter actually does a vivid, robust description of what's going on or challenges, especially challenges this system, this permanent warfare state, because if they do, they will lose their job.
And just to bring us back to the story, this is where Eisenhower becomes so important in the story itself. People who pay attention to history know that in January 1961, 11 years after NSC-68 was signed, Eisenhower delivered his farewell address and warned the American public about what he called the military-industrial complex.
What is also unknown is that his original version of his farewell address was called the military-industrial congressional complex, but he took out congressional for political reasons. But this is a description of what we are living with today.
What is ignored frequently in the telling of this history, though, is that Eisenhower, like Truman, was a principal architect of the military-industrial complex. Regardless of what he says later, both he and Truman as presidents were instrumental in the creation of the system. In Eisenhower's farewell address in 1961, he said,
"In the councils of government, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist."
And that's why the mainstream media, the capitalist-owned corporate media, also bows before, genuflects in front of this military-industrial complex, is complicit and goes along with the program. Eisenhower was describing the system that NSC-68 created, and he was admitting that even as President of the United States, even as a man who commanded the largest military operation in human history, he was either unwilling or unable to control it. The machine was already bigger than the presidency, meaning the problem here is not politicians or individual leaders. The problem is the system itself.
Well, exactly, because look at what's happened since. Every president since Eisenhower, whether they are a Democrat or Republican, has increased the military budget or held it as is. None have made any serious structural challenge to the defense establishment. Jimmy Carter couldn't do it. Ronald Reagan didn't want to. Clinton actually expanded NATO. Obama expanded the drone program. Trump added tens of billions. Biden signed the largest defense authorization in history. The two ruling class parties, fight about everything else. They'll fight about healthcare, immigration, taxes, social policy, but the defense budget or the military budget is untouchable. That's not because every president independently concludes that the military needs more money. It's because the system NSC-68 created has made it politically impossible to conclude anything else.
And this is the final irony of the deep state discourse. The people who campaigned most aggressively on dismantling the deep state have not touched the military budget except to increase it. They haven't closed a single overseas base. They have not challenged a single major weapons program. On the contrary, they are increasing and expanding these same weapons systems. They have not reduced the power of the intelligence agencies in any structural way.
Because the actual deep state, the permanent warfare state that NSC-68 built, the military-industrial complex that Eisenhower warned about, is not what they're talking about. When they say deep state, they mean regulatory agencies, they mean civil servants, they mean parts of the government that might constrain corporate power or enforce environmental regulations. NSC-68 and the permanent warfare state it created is the enemy of democracy. It is the enemy of progress. It is the enemy of the environment, and it is the enemy of peace. The U.S. political establishment has normalized it, but we should never consider it as something normal. It needs to be replaced. But that will be the work of the people, not those who wield political power. That's our show. We'll be back soon with more episodes in the series. Before we go, we want to say thank you to all of our patrons. Without you, we could not keep the show on the air. And a big thank you to our dear friend John Preisner, whose audio engineering skills makes this show what it is.